So, moving towards what we're discussing today, politics in ancient Athens. Now, the intellectual history of politics in ancient Athens revolves around the emergence of demokratia and the conceptual debates that accompany it. Cleisthenes, late 6th century BCE reforms, redefined the polis as a participatory entity, emphasizing isonomia, equality before the law, and direct governance through institutions like the assembly and law courts. Yet Athenian democracy was never ideologically static, it was contested both in practice and in thought, with ongoing tensions over citizenship, elite influence, and the limits of popular rule. I apologise for my bastardisation of beautiful words. My limited linguistic ability outside of the Anglosphere is a damning indictment of my ability. But intellectual historians such as Skinner and Pocock have highlighted the significance of Athens as a site where the language of political participation first actually crystallised. However, they also caution against imposing modern democratic ideals onto the Athenian model. You can draw pathways, if you so desire, through from, say, the Athenian or Roman model of democracy to the interregnum, the English Civil War. There's a lot of Republicans during the 17th century who are reading ancient texts and getting inspired by Republican movements, but it's not a direct path. It's not a direct linkage. So when we look at Plato, he famously critiqued democracy as unstable and prone to demagoguery, proposing a rule by philosophers in the Republic, while Aristotle, in his Politics, saw a more empirical balance between democracy and aristocracy. Meanwhile, sophists such as Protagoras challenged the idea of fixed political truths, emphasising rhetoric and persuasion in shaping governance. These debates established fundamental political concepts: citizenship, deliberation, and constitutional order, whose influence extended through Rome, the Renaissance, and modern democratic thought. So I also wanted, because I wasn't sure how much people would know about the politics of ancient Greece, I wanted to go through the different schools of thought in the politics of ancient Greece. Now, the political thought of ancient Greece was shaped by competing schools of philosophy, each offering distinct visions of governance and the good life. So Plato, reacting to the instability of Athenian democracy and the execution of Socrates, his tutor, proposed in the Republic a hierarchical state ruled by philosopher-kings, where justice was achieved through a rigid class structure. Now, he has a family link there because during the reign of what are called the 30 tyrants, Plato's cousin and also Plato's uncle are part of this government that's a sort of puppet government of Sparta that's imposed on Athens, and he sees that as a more sort of functional government to the democracy that had lost in the war against Sparta. And yeah, so he's certainly a critic of democracy, particularly in their putting to death of his tutor Socrates for corrupting the youth of Athens. However, Aristotle in the Politics took a far more empirical approach and sought to analyse different constitutions and advocated a mixed government that balanced democracy and aristocracy to prevent their excesses of either. Epicurus, in contrast, rejected political engagement altogether, arguing that true happiness lay in withdrawal from public life. His philosophy emphasised self-sufficiency, inner peace, and the avoidance of political turmoil, viewing participation in politics as a source of anxiety rather than of fulfilment. The Cynics took an even more radical stance, rejecting societal conventions and material wealth to live in accordance with nature. Figures like Diogenes mocked political institutions, emphasising personal autonomy and asceticism over civic duty. Now, Diogenes is extremely famous. I don't know how far you would know about the Cynics, but is famous for constantly critiquing every citizen in the marketplace of Athens and for rejecting social mores beyond political institutions. But for example, he would defecate in fountains and claim that that was a kind of political act of his rejection of the social standards of ancient Athens. And also Epicurus, his school, I don't think I'd said, but his school was called the Garden, so where all these hedonists. So when we studied John Stuart Mill, Epicurus is a heavy influence on James Mill, his father, and Jeremy Bentham in the formation of utilitarianism, because it's focused around pleasure and, well, the utilitarians change it to happiness, but Epicurus is their kind of intellectual bedrock for making their argument. These philosophical traditions rejected broader tensions in Greek political life between order and liberty, engagement and withdrawal, hierarchy and equality. While Plato and Aristotle sought ways to refine or reform governance, Epicurus, and the Cynics as well, questioned its very necessity. Their debates laid the groundwork for later political philosophy, influencing heavily Roman thought, and then through Renaissance discovery, shaping early modern ideas on government and individual autonomy. Right. Now, this is a term that, yeah, unless you'd really sort of delved into ancient thought, probably wouldn't have come across, but the axial age. Did we touch on this at all in that myth module? I know that we sort of compared ancient philosophy and ancient myths, but this was a term that we studied up in St Andrews, and the axial age is a term that was coined by Karl Jaspers, and it marks a period of profound intellectual and spiritual transformation across multiple civilizations. During this time, independent traditions emerged in Greece, India, China, and the Near East. So, say Zoroastrianism in Arabia, or Confucius in China, or the Buddha in India. These all fundamentally reshaped political and ethical thought across all of these different parts of the globe, obviously excluding Oceania and the Americas, which post-colonialists who critique Karl Jaspers' term take up quite an omission on his part there. But Jaspers and later intellectuals, including Charles Taylor, have emphasised how the axial age thinkers shifted political discourse, philosophical discourse, and mythic discourse as well, from these kind of more quintessential mythological worldviews, where say that a god in ancient Greece could descend from Mount Olympus and engage in everyday life. There are all of these myths when you go back further than Plato to, say, Homer and the poets. All of these myths that were around, that maybe Zeus sometimes takes human form and walks down the mountain and interacts with ancient Greeks. What Jaspers was trying to say is that during the time of Plato and all of these thinkers across the world, these kind of much more mythic explanations for society started to become much more structured and rigid about how political states actually operate. In China, Confucius emphasized moral cultivation and a structured social hierarchy, while Taoist thinkers like Lao Tzu advocated a retreat from rigid governance in favor of harmony with nature. In India, the Buddha challenged Brahminical society and authority, proposing an ethical path independent of caste and ritual. Meanwhile, in the Greek world, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle developed rational critiques of politics and ethics, laying the groundwork for later philosophical traditions. What unites these diverse traditions is their concern with how individuals relate to power, to the state, and the cosmos. Pocock has noted that the axial age's thought contributed to later civic and political traditions, influencing both religious and secular governance models. Whether through Confucian bureaucracy, Buddhist renunciation, or Greek constitutionalism, the period saw the birth of ideas that would shape global politics, or global political thought, for a millennium. There's some great series by the BBC on this as well, about thinkers in different regions of the world, all operating at the same time. I mean, even Christ is sometimes included within the axial age bracket, as much as it says 800 to 200 BCE. Christ is sometimes included as a figure within the axial age, so it's a very interesting sort of conceptual paradigm to study. So what about Plato himself? Well, Plato was one of the most influential philosophers of the ancient world, whose work shaped Western thought in politics, metaphysics, and ethics. He was a student of Socrates and the tutor of Aristotle. He founded the Academy in Athens, the first known institution of higher learning. His writings, presented as a dialogue, explore the nature of justice, the ideal state, and the role of philosophy in governance, with the Republic being his most famous political work. There's a slight irony here that he presents all of his work in dialogue, because one of his critiques is that you want everything to be real, and he sort of invents characters who take up different political positions, which, with the excerpt of the Republic that we set, doesn't particularly sit nicely with his idea that everything should be as real as possible. But that's just a sort of critique of his attitude anyway. He was deeply influenced by the instability of Athenian democracy, the execution of Socrates, as I said earlier, for corrupting the youth of Athens, for introducing new gods. Also, Socrates famously never wrote anything down, so any account that we have of Socrates is Plato's doing. And he was skeptical of the idea of popular rule, arguing that governance should be based on wisdom rather than the will of the majority. He envisaged an ideal state ruled by philosopher-kings, where a rigid class structure ensured harmony and justice. His theory of forms posited that the material world is a mere shadow of a higher, unchanging reality, an idea that shaped not only philosophy, but also later theological and political thought. And as Jack and I were discussing on Tuesday, you see a lot of Plato coming through in someone like St. Augustine. So it'll be a lovely segue into next week's discussion. But while his vision of an ideal state has been both admired and critiqued, his influence remains foundational to Western political philosophy, as seen in the title of this book, From Plato to NATO. But also, there are plenty of historians who say from Plato to Auschwitz. So it's like it's not necessarily that Plato led to beautiful democratic structures. Also, Plato's rigidity and idea that democracy doesn't work, it was also an inspiration to both communist Soviet dictatorships and fascist dictatorships of the 20th century. So before we go into the Republic itself, just run through some of the other quintessential texts, supplementary material. Plato's Apology and the Crito offer complementary insights into Socrates' philosophy and his stance on justice, duty, and the state. The Apology presents Socrates' defense at his trial in 399 BC, where he is accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety. Rather than pleading for mercy, he defends his life's missions of questioning and seeking truth, arguing that his role as a social and moral critic benefits Athens. And he actually, when they say that Socrates is going to be sentenced to death, instead of, he gets to have a counter plea. And Socrates, instead of maybe saying like, oh, I should flee the state of Athens, I should go into exile, he says, well, actually, because you've put such a heavy burden on me for the punishment that you're wanting to be implemented, he says that you should pay me a pension for the rest of my life for the contribution I've made to Athens. So obviously that just enrages those who want to sentence to death even more. He famously declares that the unexamined life is not worth living, emphasizing the philosopher's duty to pursue wisdom, even at personal cost. His refusal to renounce his beliefs leads to his condemnation and death sentence, the drinking of the hemlock, reinforcing his commitment to principle over self-preservation. In the Crito, which is written as a dialogue between Socrates and his friend Crito, the philosopher rejects an opportunity to escape before his execution. He argues that fleeing would undermine the very laws and institutions he has spent his life upholding. He introduces the idea of a social contract, that term that we discussed so much in the last series, asserting that by living in Athens and benefiting from its laws, he has implicitly agreed to abide by them, even when they lead to injustice. So this is the Lockean tacit consent idea that you've been reared and raised by a society and therefore have a sort of volitional or non-volitional obligation to that state. Together, these works portray Socrates as a figure who values ethical consistency over personal survival, shaping later discussions on civil disobedience, duty, and the legitimacy of state authority. No questions or anything so far in terms of anything I've said? No, nothing particularly like befogging. Yes, go on.
I've kind of an annoying question.
No worries.
A lot of what we know about Socrates is through Plato's account of him.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we kind of figure out where Socrates ends, Plato begins?
Well, exactly, and there is a question of where does Socrates start? Because some people believe that he didn't actually exist, that it's just a figment of Plato's imagination. So we really don't know where that voice has come from. And again, this is a critique, considering what he's saying in this passage of the Republic, that you have to make everything so close to fact. It seems ironic that he's the kind of narrator of this. Plato's the narrator of a Socrates, because, as you say, we don't actually know anything about Socrates other than Plato, so it could just be a figment of the imagination. I hope that answers it in a roundabout way. But yeah, Plato's Phaedo and the Symposium both explore fundamental philosophical themes, though in different contexts, one focusing on the immorality of the soul, the other on the nature of love. The Phaedo is a dialogue set on the final days of Socrates' life, a recurring theme, recounting his last conversation with his followers before his execution. Here, Socrates presents several arguments for the immortality of the soul, including the theory of recollection, the idea that knowledge is innate and rediscovered through learning, and the argument from opposites, that life and death are part of a natural cycle. He describes the philosopher's task as a preparation for death, where detachment from bodily desires allows the soul to seek truth and attain a purer form of existence. This dialogue had a lasting impact on later religious and philosophical traditions, influencing ideas about the afterlife and the relationship between body and soul. The Symposium, by contrast, is a dramatic dialogue structured around a series of speeches on the nature of love, or eros. All okay, Scott?
Yeah, that's just my phone exploded.
Oh. Given at a banquet. The most famous contribution comes from, you guessed it, Socrates, who, drawing on Diotima's teachings, presents love as a ladder of ascent from physical attraction to the love of wisdom and ultimately to the appreciation of the form of the good. The concept of love as a means of intellectual and spiritual transcendence influenced later philosophical and theological thought, particularly in Neoplatonism and Christian mysticism. There's a Christian mystic who talks about the garden of spirituality, and that you have to sort of tend the garden in different stages to be able to attain God. So you can see a direct influence on Christianity from this text. Together, the Phaedo and Symposium illustrate Plato's vision of philosophy as a pursuit that elevates the soul beyond the material world. We're getting there. We're getting very, very close now. Plato's Timaeus and Republic in the relationship between the physical and the metaphysical, but they do so in very distinct ways. The Timaeus, which is a heavy influence on Hegel, a massive warning sign to maybe steer clear of that book, it's a largely cosmological dialogue that focuses on the creation of the universe. In it, Plato defines his account of the world's origins, suggesting that the cosmos was crafted by a divine rational being, the demiurge, according to eternal unchanging forms. The dialogue emphasizes the harmony and order of the universe and the connection between the soul and the cosmos. Plato introduces the idea of the world soul, which binds the universe together, and argues that the material world is an imperfect reflection of the perfect forms that exist in the realm of the intellect. The Timaeus thus offers a metaphysical framework that ties together the physical and spiritual dimensions of reality, with profound implications for understanding the relationship between the sensible world and philosophical thought. In the Republic, the text that we are addressing today, Plato shifts to the ideal city-state and the nature of justice. Through the allegory of the cave and the concept of the philosopher-king, Plato argues that a just society must be structured to reflect the harmony found in the world's soul, with each class performing its proper role in accordance with its natural abilities. And he creates this sort of psychological, political duality that if you have a healthy mind, healthy brain, where every part is functioning to make the individual function properly, then that's just like the state, that every component of the state also needs to function properly and to its maximum ability. The Republic outlines a vision of an ideal society governed by wisdom, with rulers, philosophers, guiding the state through knowledge of the forms, while the Timaeus provides a metaphysical foundation for understanding the cosmos. The Republic applies these ideas to the political realm, linking justice in the city to the harmony of the soul. Together, these dialogues highlight Plato's commitment to a world of eternal forms and the idea that both the physical world and political order must reflect this higher, immutable truth. Any questions at this point of anything? Perfect. Okay. So what about the Republic, Book 3? Well, Book 3 of the Republic continues Plato's exploration of justice by focusing on education and formation of the guardian class, those who will rule and defend the ideal state. Here, Plato emphasizes the role of paideia, education and cultural formation, in shaping both individual character and civic harmony. He argues that the stories, music and poetry allowed in the polis must be carefully curated to instill virtues such as courage and discipline and reverence for the common good. The guardians in particular must be raised in an environment that fosters loyalty to the state and a commitment to truth rather than personal ambition or material wealth. This emphasis on cultural transmission closely relates to the concept of heritage, what we're discussing, the idea that the values, myths and traditions of a society must be preserved and passed down to maintain stability and identity. Plato's concern with regulating cultural narratives reflects a broader tension in intellectual history. How far should heritage be actively shaped by elites, and to what extent should it evolve organically? His strict educational controls contrast with more pluralistic or historical understandings of heritage, where traditions are seen as fluid and subject to reinterpretation. Yet his work remains a key early articulation of the power of cultural inheritance in shaping political order. This is what we shall look at today. So I have a few questions there. I know that people online can't see the questions, but yeah, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and yeah, and then we'll get going. Any questions of anything that I've said thus far, or any more sort of explanation of the Republic itself? I'm sort of happy, like what the guardians are, or how the state should be structured, or anything along those lines.
Yeah, what did Plato mean by like an elite?
So he talks about this idea of a guardian class, so a class of people that are cut off from everyday life, essentially, which is very reminiscent of what we were talking about in the Hayek session, because Hayek is clearly heavily influenced by Platonic thought. But essentially that you'd have this kind of group of men. He thinks that women are susceptible to, well, I mean, in this he talks about women being susceptible to madness, and that poetry that describes madness should be left to women or lesser men. So we can
Don't we equate them to children at some point?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Right.
I mean, apologists of Plato try and say that, well, he did say that there could be like philosopher-kings and this sort of thing, but ultimately, obviously, because that's just the context of his time, he's extremely misogynistic.
Well, it's really an ultimate, I don't know, children are uninhibited and have these wonderful imaginations. So really, he's actually giving us a wonderful, I don't know, compliment.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm an apologist, so there we go.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's difficult, but he certainly doesn't see the guardian class. Obviously, the guardian class aren't the top of the philosopher-kings, people like him who think hard about society and about the way that society should be heading, and they're the ones who should actually be ruling society. But those philosopher-kings would be few and not operating the mechanics of the state. The mechanics of the state would be operated by the guardians, who are, again, a cut-off political class, so a class of people who have no marriage, have no family, but they have a loyalty to the state because, and this is where the link to communism comes in, which is that everything would be provided for the guardian class. So all the peasantry, who he envisages being the lower class, would be happy to provide for the guardian class because they're the ones who ensure a stable state. But they have no worldly pleasure. They have no, in his eyes, they'd have no conception of the accumulation of wealth or sort of, I guess, like urges for any desire, whether that be familial to have a partner or children, or monetarily. They wouldn't really understand why you'd want to accumulate wealth. So it sort of evens out, but it does start to feel quite sort of authoritarian quite quickly, I think. However, Plato being regarded as an elitist, I've always thought is slightly erroneous, because he talks later in the Republic about the idea of the guardians being people who are casting gold. But he said that you can be born casting gold, so essentially what we would say today as a nepo baby, or inheriting this golden structure of your family. But he said they can have a heart of bronze, so they're lesser in the pile, and it's only those with a heart of gold who can truly be a guardian. So you could be the son of a regular peasant in the Athenian state and actually have this heart of gold, that if through learning, through understanding, through your contribution to the state, you can ascend to be a guardian, and a guardian who's, whilst he's casting gold, but he's got a heart of bronze, can descend to being a peasant. So it's not like he's saying that there's some eternal line of rulers. He does create a meritocratic system in his eyes, but as we know from states that try and implement these kind of rigid structures, it doesn't often end in that way. And anything else about the guardians or the philosopher-kings, or anything about his idea of the polis, or the political situation in Athens at the time? As I said, it's just when he's writing this, obviously, the heaviest thing that influences him is Socrates' death, and that's why he's so damning of democracy, because he can't understand how a democracy could put such a brilliant, intelligent, formidable academic to death. And he says that that's why democracy doesn't work, that people have short-term views of what they think is best, and ultimately those short-term views can lead to putting to death someone so brilliant and outstanding. I was going to say something else. The way that Athens puts Socrates to death is where we get our term ostracized from, because I don't know what the exact term is, but it's something like an ostra. Is this Greek bit of pottery that the Democrats, the male voting public in Athens, as long as you weren't a male slave, anyone could vote in Athens as long as you weren't a slave or a woman, essentially. And they would chuck these metal bits of pot in, these ceramic, basically bits of tile, into a bowl, and whichever side you tossed it on meant whether you were voting yes or no. And I think they were called ostras, which is where ostracon, which is where we get the term to ostracize from. But anything else on the politics or the context of Plato's day? So, Dar?
The only real thing that really probably interested me was his sort of his views on education and that separation between having a physical education, which I think he got sort of like gymnastics, and like he refers to, was having that sort of more moral or intellectual education, so things like poetry.
Yes,
that's probably what I found most interesting about the whole.
I mean, in book 3, what was I going to say? Jotted down some notes, but I can't open them up on my iPad because that's running. As we see in book 3, as Dar is saying about poetic education, he's very wary that scholars like Homer, who have come before him, because Homer's come in the very ancient Greek world. We're getting into the sort of Hellenistic period with Plato, but prior to that, we can say proper ancient Greece. And Homer's writing at that time, and he's talking about all manner of things. He's talking about obviously virtues. These things come through in all ancient Greek writers, but he also writes poetry about vices, about madness, about natural disasters, about all manner of things that for Plato are abhorrent. Why would you want to create an art? You know, this flies in the face of what we would talk about in postmodern art today, but why would you want to do an art which portrayed madness or something, you know, that's a negative connotation to the state, a storm or a flood? For Plato, he's thinking the only operation of poetry needs to be for the virtues of a good society, of a good individual. And as he says, we must ask Homer and the other poets to excuse us if we delete passages of this kind. It is not that they are bad poetry or are not popular. Indeed, the better they are as poetry, the more unsuitable they are for the ears of children or grown-ups, if they are to prefer death to slavery, as free men should. Because he's just talked about how Homer is discussing fearful soldiers, essentially, going to Troy, and ones who are worried about dying and saying that they don't want to be king of the dead. They want to be, they'd be quite happy to be enslaved rather than die, whilst the Athenians are telling the forces going to Troy, well, if you die, you will be raised up as one of the rulers of the underworld. Homer's saying, well, some of them are still saying, I prefer to be alive but a slave rather than dead and a king. And Plato's saying this is disgraceful. This is damning of our state. We can't have poetry that's endorsing this. So ultimately, what is it that Plato's saying? Well, he's saying essentially that poetry should be propaganda. It should be a propaganda for the state to advocate virtues, not vices, and there should be no mention. And again, this is where it links to the kind of fascistic critique of the Republic, because it is about kind of like extolling the best kind of virtues of the good man sort of thing, and ignoring any other sort of vices or issues.
I mean, because he said that poetry was the best form of education for the soul.
Therefore,
for the soul to be in its best form, then having access to what he refers to as the best poetry is why he believes it should be censored.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of and the same with art as well. The same with depictions.
I think it's trying to do the canon, I guess. These kind of canonical works that like what to shape and continue to shape society.
Yeah.
But it seems very static. Very like stagnated.
Yeah, completely.
Having these same works that are just meant to kind of teach the same lessons, the same group of people. Continually or over again, perpetually.
No, definitely. And I think I might have had a question that sort of built on from that. Regulation of cultural narratives, which parallel, and this is where intellectual history is brilliant, because instead of just drawing on quotes, we can try and parallel arguments. Well, today, we look at ideas of the role of heritage in shaping national identity. Both in ancient Greece and today, they involve questions of what narratives should be preserved and passed down to ensure social cohesion and unity. And modern debates also concern the role of cultural heritage in defining shared values, history, and identity. And I think there was somewhere where was it? There's something somewhere. Yeah, so there's this is where he also talks about passing it down to women of poor characters or bad men. So he says that there should be no lamenting. So the idea today, for example, in our political discourse, that you can, that if you critique, say, a nationalist or patriotic event, you're seen as talking down your country, which is very prominent in your home country's political discourse, Michelle. That you're not a true MAGA patriot if you at all critique the Great One. But I mean, the parallels are uncanny, because what Plato is saying, that we must cut out pitiful laments of our nation by famous men, again referring to Homer. But the idea that you can critique your society for Plato is off the cards. You don't lament anything that's gone wrong. You talk about how great it was. Well, those people who stormed the Capitol were liberators. They weren't causing any. They weren't following any sort of malintent. They were freedom fighters. So yeah, there's a real dark side to this kind of heritage that Plato is advocating, but at the same time, I do think that the idea, obviously, and when it comes to later philosophy, obviously advocating virtue is obviously a great thing. I don't think many people would disagree with that. But, to try and produce a society through art, through poetry, through writing, that through prose that advocates a good life. But how do you do that if you're not going to add in the elements which are negative, that are malign to the state? How do you create an idea of it? This is the Clockwork Orange kind of question. You can't be absolutely good and you can't be absolutely evil. If you remove all ability to understand evil, or to understand the bad, or to understand the undesired, how do you propagate a virtuous, flourishing society?
It's like completely opposite to Aristotle's idea of artists.
Through
tragedy.
Exactly.
We learn about ourselves, and our souls become more enriched.
And this is where Plato differs from Aristotle, because Aristotle is an empiricist. He's looking at this and trying to think practically about how the state operates, whereas Plato is purely a metaphysician, purely someone who thinks that by reasoning alone we can kind of discover these beautiful truths, the forms of these floating forms that can somehow be uncovered. Have you heard the allegory of the cave, Michelle and Scott? Yeah. About how everything we interpret is a shadow. But yeah, I mean, you could say it's completely irrational, his idea of political statehood.
What was the political significance of the cave story?
Because he thinks that there is an ideal state. I mean, he actually writes, as we studied, obviously, about Atlantis, and Atlantis being a kind of utopia, because this is where the whole origin of the myth of Atlantis comes from, and that it was this utopian society beyond what he calls the Pillars of Hercules, which was going to be my original blog name, but then I changed it to Explorations in intellectual history. But
that was the mouth of the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah, between Gibraltar and the sort of peak of Morocco, and that this utopian Atlantean society lays somewhere out there. So essentially, if we wanted to go on Plato's assumption, it would be what well, yes, and there are. I mean, some of the later scholars say that America is Atlantean, like descendants who fled by boat to, when the Spanish go to South America, they think that the Mayans and might be descendants of Atlantis. They've got this kind of unique, very advanced culture.
If you ever went to Atlanta Airport, you'd think
no, it's very true. But for him, something like Atlantis represents, and this republic that he's drawing up represents the ideal state, the eternal good form, and that is what we want to emulate, or at least get close to. And so far, no country has been able to do that. And he thinks that one of the reasons why this happens is because of democracy. He thinks that democracy is fundamentally flawed, and that trying to turn to that, you then get Polybius's what is called anacyclosis. Polybius's sequence, which is that you get a democracy. You get a monarchy. And then the monarchy becomes an aristocracy because there's more enriched people who want a say. So he thinks that this is what has happened in Athens. There was a monarchy, but you then had the nobility who, whilst they were given their privileges, wanted more power. And from that, another class of sort of the middling sort see the nobility suddenly getting a bit of power and think, well, I'm not that far off of them, so I would like a bit of that. So then it becomes a democracy. And then, because things don't happen quick enough, because people are deliberating, and because it's still only a certain clique of men who get into democracy, you get what he calls horrible sounding word. It's better to just say, I suppose, demagoguery or something like that, but it's called ochlocracy, which is the rule of the mob. So the mob supersede the parliament and say, well, we're going to get things done. And then ultimately, out of that ochlocracy, you get a Caesar figure, a tyrant, who then restores it to monarchy. And he says that this is the sequence of politics throughout history, which, to be honest, it's not that inaccurate. I mean, it depends where we sit at this point in history and what's going to happen next. But I mean, often these things are quite parallel to what Plato says all this way back. And he's very wary of that and thinks that democracy will ultimately just lead to a sort of mob rule, which he thinks is sort of happening at his time with the execution of Socrates. So when the Spartans put in the puppet tyranny, he thinks that that's a return at least to a slightly more stable state, which is why he's so praising of the 30 tyrants. Did you have another question, Dara?
I mean, for the moment, so I'm sorry, I've been lost as to where we were. Where so...
Well, we were just talking about, we obviously all the way back started with a question about poetry compared to physical education, but did you have maybe another question?
I mean, probably. I mean, obviously, I found that the most interesting. Well, how about going more into? Let's just have a look. See.
Or Michelle or Scott, if you have a question.
I mean, for a man that said to dance well and to sing well and to be well educated, I have to say that as a dancer. Just this discussion is making me kind of hate Plato.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, ignorance is bliss in his eyes.
Yeah.
Complete control freak. I think he has OCD.
Yes, very much so. I mean, yeah. He's certainly, well, I mean, we say everything's a footnote to Plato, but yeah, I mean, was there something else I had? This section.
How does Plato suggest, does he even say this? Is this something in this, as far as determining who are the guardians and who are the philosopher-kings and who, like, how, is it really, does he really acknowledge how it's determined? He's
quite loose on these things. I mean, when we were talking about the symposium in the introduction, there is this idea that sort of young men need to be cultivated into a philosophical life, and there'll be a few chosen through his academy that through these banquets and things that are being laid on for young philosophers, that they will experience with older men, kind of great discussion, great debate, romantic interaction, obviously, because Athenian society is very liberal around homosexuality. So there's that element of cultivation as well. And he thinks that through that, well, there's also obviously this question of purity, and he thinks that that it would be wrong for a guardian to engage with a woman. So obviously that's a massive part of what's written in the symposium. And he thinks that through that intellectual cultivation, you will create a class of guardians, and the philosopher-kings will sort of rise out of that and become the cast in gold, the guardians cast in silver, and the peasantry cast in bronze. That isn't to say that the peasantry aren't good. It's, I mean, later in philosophical thought, you have thinkers in the 19th century who talk about, like, people fulfilling their station, fulfilling their position in life, and it doesn't mean that there's a sort of value judgment made about their contribution. And Plato's certainly not saying that there's a value judgment about these different increments, these different steps on the ladder of the political system. He's saying that just everybody has a point of self-actualization, what Aristotle would go on to call eudaimonia, flourishing, and each individual's flourishing is to a different extent. Now, just because we hear the terms gold, silver, and bronze, it makes it sound much more kind of classist and sort of like rigid. But to Plato, he's talking about this much more in a way that's sort of like that's your potential. If you're casting gold, you're gold because you can lead, or you're silver because you can protect the peasantry, you can protect the philosopher-king, you can protect your state. And if you're casting bronze, well, that means you're the contributor. And he goes on in the Republic to say that never think of sort of this in a kind of essentially like a snobby way. He sort of says, he says the peasantry, if they revolt, the guardians will lose everything they have, because the guardians can't farm and work themselves. They're not allowed in Plato's state. They have to be constantly thinking about the protection of the state and the working of the state. And the philosopher-kings need to be constantly thinking about guiding society and where society is going to go next. And the peasantry need to be thinking about production and about maintaining the state. And he says that if any of those elements fall apart, they're all equal, which again goes back to this kind of communist idea. And Antonio Gramsci comes up with a system very similar, in the sense that he says that there needs to be like an intellectual class during a communist revolution. He says that there needs to be an intellectual class guiding society, and that doesn't mean that they're an elite, but it just, exactly.
He also said that, or the people who are chosen to be like the philosopher-king should be ruled by, those people not be driven by personal wealth, but actually, want to improve things and make things better.
Exactly.
But, in reality terms, that's never always been the case.
No.
History's always shown that, people that always come, whether it comes from inherited wealth, the people that come, rise through the classes, it never really happens. So.
Well, we've talked a lot, haven't we, about Caesar figures, this idea that when there's some sort of new polity, you might start with democracy, and this kind of counters the Polybian sequence, the anacyclosis, but that when there's a revolution, often a tyrant emerges very quickly. And the only example of where that doesn't happen, amazingly, is in your home country. The only example of where a revolution doesn't lead to a Caesar figure is the American Revolution.
Yeah.
You could just say it's a slow burn Caesar figure, because ultimately, as which historian is it? I don't know if it's not Mill, but in the 19th century says that Britain is a democracy pretending to be a monarchy, and that America is a monarchy pretending to be a democracy. Ultimately, other than America, you only have George Washington, who returns to his plough, so to speak. Sequence of rulers. Obviously, communist regimes throw up dictators here, there, and everywhere. Fascist regimes, dictators here, there, and everywhere. So as Dara's saying, it's not really something that ever comes to fruition. However, there are elements of what Plato's saying that we can see in some meritocratic societies. I love referencing it, but take Switzerland, when Switzerland was in its formation in Geneva. This is obviously a very religious example, but Calvinist ministers were the ones who were the guardian class of the canton of Geneva, because they were sort of nominated, obviously, by their liturgy or by their parish, and thereby made rules based on the fact that they were removed from society and could think clearly about what was best for Geneva. And obviously Geneva is an example which many political theorists in the 18th and 19th centuries talk about, and then the Swiss Confederation as being an ideal political state. And those Calvinist ministers were completely removed from society and making decisions on behalf of the canton. In America, you still have the age brackets for when you can join the representatives, the Senate, and for the presidency. The idea being that the more you mature, the more sort of well-posed you are to run for that state. Again, where a mature man in the White House is longed for right now. So elements come through, but the actual reality, and when we look at these things in intellectual history, does it have an impact? Well, it doesn't really. But the idea of the forms and the allegory of the cave has a heavy influence on Christianity, and that's why in the Renaissance, Plato, much more than Aristotle, is integrated in many ways into these ideas. And when we look at the city of God, the idea that there's a city, a heavenly city that the political secular state can emulate is echoing heavily from this, that somehow through divine law, through biblical scripture, you can emulate political laws based on scriptural laws to create the ideal society. Yes, obviously it's heavily Christian, but it's also heavily Platonic as well.
I mean, yeah, to defend Plato a bit. I mean, I can't exactly say I like everything he says, but there is something quite noble about striving for these objective truths, these higher truths, without this idea of like a form to strive for, or like a society to kind of to model yourself on. Like it's kind of things become like irrelevant and stuff. I think it's important that people like him exist and remind us to do that. I think
definitely. No, I completely agree, and I think when it comes to his discussion of poetry and art, it's completely true that we should be, because he says that if we don't produce poetry that is of a caliber for our guardians, then he says we won't be caring for the moral welfare of our guardians, and then he goes on for his slightly random political rant about how we will not allow them to take the parts of women, young or old, for their men, nor to represent them abusing their husbands or presumptuously quarrelling with heaven when they imagine themselves happy, or crying and complaining in misfortune. Far less we can permit representation of women in sickness or love or childbirth. So it's an extremely misogynistic society, obviously, and it's also a slaveholder society, so not to counter Scott too much, but obviously this envisaging of a democracy is very limited to a property holding male class. But the idea that you're going to try and instill virtues in people is obviously not a bad thing at all, and that you're going to have some objective moral. And I'm sure Jack would be absolutely loving this discussion if he was here, because for him as a Catholic, the idea of objective moral structures are pivotal, and he thinks in the kind of Nietzschean way that the thing that we've lost when we discuss politics today is the ethical. Everything in politics these days is rooted around economics, around money, which would absolutely enrage Plato. The idea that the political structure is solely rooted around finance and the economy. If you listen to a parliamentary debate, you don't hear people proselytizing different ethical causes, or if you do, the chamber's got 5 people in it. Whereas when it's about money and finance, the chamber's rammed with people to talk about how much money. Rory Stewart talking about how we need to look after hedgehogs gets 5 people versus
a lot of people listen to Rory Stewart.
Yeah, they do now. Please will be pleased. But yeah, any other questions, Dan?
There was another bit. It goes off a little bit about the main part about education. He criticises things about, doesn't he, about like things like medicine and health, where he sort of says, people that aren't able or just have minor ailments, they should sort of recover naturally, and people who can't.
Yeah.
Are sort of, they should sort of be left to their own devices.
Yeah.
Which I found a bit odd.
What, in what sense?
Well, I just sense it's a bit, nasty for a start. If you can't recover naturally, then
you're sort of done for.
It's quite a.
But this comes back to his questioning of the health of the mind and the body, which he creates this dualist system about the state, and if there's an unhealthy part of the individual, then the state will also be unhealthy. If it's malfunctioning, that's a malfunctioning state. And he says that political issues in the state are just like a mental issue, an ability to not reason far enough to unite every aspect of your passion, your reason.
This is a very intellectual history kind of question. But in the early modern period and stuff, this kind of idea of like the body politic emerged. Like the king is the head, and then the state is the body. How is that related in any way?
Very much so. Yeah.
The state is the mind.
I mean, Hobbes, who's probably the first proponent of that in kind of political discourse. Obviously, you have the body politic as an idea even prior to Hobbes, through religious discourse, coming up to someone like Cardinal Bellarmine, who's trying to argue against the Reformation and about the secular body and the spiritual body. But when Hobbes depicts it, yeah, completely, that he's drawing on Plato entirely to talk about the health of this kind of very biopolitical sort of envisaging of the state, that if there's a malfunction, that's an unhealthy state. It's like the state's been poisoned. You get a lot of these kind of terminologies, which Foucault, who will be at the end of this series, if you haven't seen already, yeah, will be coming up. But his analysis of the way that the political state has evolved, you know, looking at ideas of illness, sickness, poison. And I know you like that, Scott, in terms of the what's the term for like inside the body, or sort of like having a virus or something, that you're sort of uncomfortable with having a virus. Was it? Well, it wasn't metamodernism, was it? But sort of
posthumanism.
Posthumanism, yeah.
I've actually just read
being uncontrollable, you can't control. Yeah, lack of autonomy.
I recently read a great book called The Diseases Metaphor by Susan Sontag.
Right.
And it talks about her idea is like she kind of assesses how historically people have used cancer, TB, and AIDS as metaphors for various things, including political metaphors. So when we talk about like a cancer on the state or something like that, it's like the US's AIDS or something. It's like it's like this metaphor about societal decline and stuff, and it's all about the body politic. And her argument is that we should move away from interpretation, that we shouldn't kind of try to kind of create metaphors out of illness, because it removes the reality of the actual experience of illness and the suffering of people dealing with illness. Like it takes it away from them and makes it harder for them to like live their lives. But it's completely bound up in this idea of that goes all the way back to Plato about the state being like an organic entity, being like a mind or a body. Although, would you have thought the mind is an organic entity? I don't know.
Not necessarily. And I was going to say that I don't think you can necessarily pin all of the blame at Plato's door, because one of the massive influences of this kind of naturalist idea of trying to interpret nature and therefore apply it to the body politic comes with Christianity. I mean, the naturalistic fallacy, the idea that because we can interpret divine law through nature, and therefore if nature's doing something, then the body politic should emulate it, is massively Christian. It's like, you know, I'm sure they're drawing on Plato somewhat with what we've discussed, but it's massively kind of like, oh, well, and it's called the naturalistic fallacy, or the is-ought problem in David Hume's semantics, that because things are a way in nature, that's what they ought to be in society. And that comes with religion massively, because you've got divine law, human law, natural law, and that divine law is passed down to human law. Divine law, natural law, human law. So that divine law has passed down from biblical scripture, from the word of God, into nature, into the world that we experience, and therefore human law, the law of the city-state, should emulate nature because it's the closest interpretation to divine law. And completely. But does anyone else have any questions? Or anyone online, if anyone wants to ask a question? I can't actually see the chat. No, I can't see any questions. Good. Right. If anyone else has any questions, or we can conclude as and when. But do I have anything else up there that I wanted to discuss? Or do I have anything else? Government by the truly rich, those, that is, whose riches consist not of money, but of the happiness of a right and rational life. Now, this kind of closes quite a lot of the discussions that we were having, because, as I was saying, the guardians don't get a salary for what they're doing. They just get their sustenance to maintain their life, but they don't have to labour like the peasantry. But the peasantry can engage in all the joys and desires of a regular human life. But for Plato, the idea of being a guardian is that your reason has led you there. Now, Plato is the birth, as I was saying earlier, of rationalism, of everything that Descartes will explore in the proto-Enlightenment or the early Enlightenment. and this is sort of what you were asking, Michelle, that the guardian class will achieve their position. It's always a nice cop-out for philosophers, but will achieve their position because their rationality will have led them there. Whatever that means. But by the reason of individuals in the city-state, all will concur that the guardians, because they're not interested in money, you'll be sitting with this nice group of men in a nice columned hall and having a banquet with Plato, and everyone will go, he's not interested in.
It's like a party follow.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's not a career choice. That is your flourishing. That people will communally recognise that he is a guardian, sort of thing. He's not interested in money. He's not interested in wealth. He's not interested in status. He's simply a brilliant individual. That would be the sort of conclusion of that from that passage.
What do you think Plato would have thought of cancel culture? Like that idea, if you're a guardian in like Plato's Republic, and suddenly someone's like, "Oh, wait a second, this guy did this,"
but by de facto they wouldn't be cancelled because their rationality would have led them to a perfect position where they wouldn't get anything wrong. Which is again always a cop out with these kind of philosophers. Which is it's the two cop outs I find are either rationality or God. Like even Descartes, who does both, then ends his Confessions by going, all of the theory that I've analysed here, how we can understand whether we're being, whether we're living, and then at the end of his Confessions, he says, yes, and I know that there's an issue with just saying that, like, by rationalising we can work out that we're alive, but ultimately the solution for that's God, and then just ends his book. But it's the same for philosophers like Plato with rationalism, because they just go, well, by rationalism we'll get there. And it's the same with Kant. It's the same with but if we rationalise it far enough, we'll work out what a structured, ethical, universal system is for everyone to live by. Well, it's quite difficult for people to rationalise purely to work out this ethical system. And for the critique of Plato, it's quite difficult for us to work out how we rationalise to create a political structure like he envisages. So I think that's a fundamental flaw. I don't know if anyone else has any critiques or questions or queries to conclude the session.
I have one more. Sorry.
You have one more?
One more. Plato, you talked a bit about the city. Plato's idea of the city is like a political entity, as opposed to like an architectural or a geological kind of like a place of human geography. It's like a political thing.
Yeah.
How is Plato's thought distinctly urban? Or can it be applied in like a rural setting, do you think?
I think it probably is distinctly urban, but integrating obviously the suburban of ancient Athens for the peasantry. That isn't to say that it's kind of uniquely a city. On the example of Athens, on the example of his description of Atlantis, obviously that's in his eyes, a small, perfect city in the middle of the sea. So it's not like it's a conventional city, but it certainly is the metropole. And yeah,
it's not too different to like Le Corbusier, like in the beginning of these like modernist architects who designed these like perfect garden cities and stuff.
Yeah.
It's like not too different to that in the sense that he's creating this is a perfect form of a city out there that will function perfectly.
Yeah.
Create this. I don't know. He doesn't specifically talk about like tower blocks or like street width.
Well, the creation of Paris at the turn of the sort of fin de siècle, the kind of ostracizing of different groups to different arrondissements of Paris. I mean, that's even in its circular nature is very similar to Plato's ideal of Atlantis. That Atlantis had these kind of bits of land, water. I don't know if you've ever seen an image of what Atlantis is supposed to be, but sort of like, that they're these kind of like land spirals, very much like Paris, like a snail, with watery canals that sort of interrupt them. And in that idea, you'd have the philosopher-kings sitting in the middle of the snail, the guardians on one rim, and then you'd have the peasantry on the outer rim, as if to kind of separate them up to the core political rule. So yeah, when it comes to geography, that's what I would say is probably closest. Yeah.
Interesting.
In terms of everything that he sort of debates in terms of like, education and, like, how do you think that would sort of transfer to the way things sort of discussed today? Do you think there would be any link to
sort of,
education and how education forms people's opinions and forms the way that forms their life, essentially?
Well, I mean, obviously, most liberal democracies these days do claim to be meritocratic. We can debate how far most societies are actually meritocratic, but I mean, his core idea, I personally think, you can dispute me, but I personally think what he is putting forward is a meritocracy. And obviously, that's a cornerstone of what we're supposed to hold dear in liberal democracies. How quickly that falls into this cycle of easily passing into a kind of nepotism and kind of oligarchy is the issue, isn't it? But I do think that ultimately what he's saying does relate to our sort of educational system, that ultimately you can go to university, or you can do an apprenticeship, or you can do this. And the idea is that there shouldn't be any value judgment placed on those things. Obviously, in the UK, in America, in various countries, there are still value judgments, or you should go to university, it's needed. But the idea for Plato would be that if none of your family have gone to university, you should be able to go to university if you think that's what will fulfill your potential. Or you should do an apprenticeship if that's what you think should fulfill your potential. It shouldn't be a question of placing a value judgment on one of those things. But again, this comes back to, by that point when you make that decision, you will have rationalized that that's your decision. You will have thought logically about it. And ultimately, that's quite hard for most individuals who are going through multiple pressures and stresses and pressures from family or friends or whatever. They can't just sit in a room and go, I know that my potential is fulfilling my history degree, rather than I need to get a history degree if I want to make X salary, or I want to impress my parents, or I want to get an experience or something like that. None of those things for Plato should matter. It should be that you think that that is where you are supposed to be, and you have rationalized that that's where you're supposed to be. And that if every component of society did that, you'd have this hierarchy, but non-judgmental hierarchy that compose the state. That would be what I'd say. So it is there. Plato is everywhere. But, yeah. Anything else?
No, just like utopia, non-judgmental.
Yeah, I know, and it's funny, isn't it, that we are sort of saying that Plato is the birthplace of dystopia and of utopia, but that's why he's the birthplace of political philosophy. And I think that's a lovely place to end this session. Thank you. And thank you to everyone online. I will be ending the session now. So yeah, thank you for joining, and see you next week for St. Augustine with Jack as well.
Good.